Welcome to our lecture on the building of communism in the new state of the Soviet Union. In our previous lecture, we had considered some of the turmoil and upheaval in Europe in the aftermath of the First World War. We'll consider in this lecture a particular case of a new political project, the building of communism. This is also in part a story of ideological adaptation to disappointment. Because Lenin's expectations and the expectations of his fellow Bolsheviks in an imminent worldwide revolution after they had launched the Russian Revolution were disappointed. How might they adapt? The reality which the Bolshevik movement and Lenin faced from the summer of 1918 was not the worldwide workers' revolt they had expected, but rather, from the summer of that year, a complicated civil war, which broke out in the territory of the Russian Empire and involved both domestic opponents as well as an array of outside forces. The Bolsheviks felt that they were clinging to power and were not sure that they would succeed in doing so, but were determined, for the sake of their revolution, to try their utmost. The civil war that followed was one of incredible ferocity. It was marked by unspeakable atrocities on all sides. The numbers of those who died as a result of this civil conflict are truly staggering. Some estimates suggest that somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 million may have died in the territories of the former Russian Empire, which would represent a staggering number 5 times as large as that of the dead suffered by the Russian Empire during the First World War. Some estimates for all of the Russian deaths by violence, disease, and hunger that followed upon the Civil War for the years 1918 to 1922, in fact, run as high as 20 million. The turmoil, the disorder, the viciousness of the Civil War finds at least some reflection in the riveting novel of Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago, as well as the gripping film made from that novel, which seeks to communicate some of the changes and uncertainty of those times. The Bolsheviks faced off in the Civil War against a panoply, a range of forces. They were called collectively the Whites, in distinction to the Red forces of the Communists. The anti-Bolshevik forces, called the Whites, were in fact not a monolithic group. They instead consisted of many different political orientations, which range from, on the one hand, out-and-out monarchists who hoped for some restoration of the Romanov dynasty, all the way to Democrats and social revolutionaries. The Whites included social revolutionary activists spread across Russia. They included the Southern Army of General Denikin, who had gathered together the remnants of the officers and loyal troops of the Tsarist regime in the south, Admiral Alexander Kolchak's forces in Siberia, who had carved off an area of control in that part of the Russian Empire, General Wrangel in the Caucasus, and General Yudenich in the Baltic region. These disparate forces, these disparate elements of the Whites would seek to work together in order to take power back from the Bolshevik Red forces. But ultimately, the Whites would lack coordination, they would lack mutual agreement, they lacked even a certain minimum agreement on political aims to be pursued, as well as a coordinated strategy. But the Bolsheviks were also threatened not only by this disparate group of white Russian forces, as they came to be called, but also by a complicated phenomenon which was called at the time Allied intervention. This too represented an often confusing swirl of actors and forces on the territory of the former Russian Empire. It included a dramatic cast of characters, among them an entire Czech legion, which rampaged from one part of the Russian Empire to the other. This Czech legion was made up of 40,000 former prisoners of war who earlier had been fighting for the Habsburg monarchy, had been taken prisoner by the Russians and then had been organized as prisoners into a new army to serve as reinforcements for the Allies. Seeking to find a way to the West in order to join the continuing war against the Germans, this Czech legion soon found itself, almost accidentally, in control of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They opposed the Bolsheviks because of what they conceived to be the traitorousness of Lenin in taking the Bolshevik regime out of the war, and soon were at loggerheads with a new regime. In order to protect military supplies, which the Western Allies had sent to the Russian Empire to aid the war effort of their Eastern ally, and to muster at least some support for the White forces, the Western Allies also landed some forces on the Empire's edges. These included the British, French, American expeditionary forces, as well as the Japanese in the East. While these Western Allied forces did not fight on the front lines against the Bolsheviks, their presence on the soil of the former Russian Empire provided an opportunity for the Bolsheviks to present themselves not only as revolutionaries who were remaking the world anew, but also to muster nationalist outrage increasingly against such a venture of Allied intervention. Later, this Allied intervention would be used as a potent tool to propaganda effect in ways which did not necessarily match the confused and ultimately ineffectual intervention by the Allies. Another war, to top it all off, also flared up on the borderlands of the Russian Empire when the Poles, who had reestablished national independence and sought to make that national independence as expansive and as much in the borders of the earlier Polish Commonwealth as possible, had moved into Ukrainian territory in the spring of 1920, into the borderlands between the Russian heartland and Poland. The Soviets had counterattacked under the leadership of a remarkably talented young officer, in fact, earlier an officer in the Imperial Army, General Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who aimed for something more than simply staving off the Poles, but with the encouragement of the Bolsheviks, aimed not only to throw back the Polish attack, but in fact to go crashing right through Poland in order to establish a link with the revolts breaking out in the industrial heartlands of Germany. The aim was to build, as it was put at the time, a red bridge to Europe. This red bridge would allow for the Bolsheviks to finally make common cause with radical socialists in Germany and elsewhere, and it was hoped to set the world ablaze. In fact, this counterattack was halted right outside of the gates of Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and what later was referred to as the miracle of the Vistula. And at this spot, at this event, the Poles still commemorate this as yet another occasion when the Poles have saved Europe from a danger. Peace between Poland and the Bolshevik regime was signed in 1921, and it really marked a decisive end to certain hopes for the linking up with radical revolution in the West. By late 1920, the civil war in the areas of the Russian Empire had largely ended. The Western Allies withdrew their small interventionist forces, and the Soviet regime had survived. As the Bolsheviks took stock of the reasons for their victory, there were several that stood out and testified to their determination. The first was, simply put, that the Bolsheviks had been better organized, more disciplined, and had been more centralized than their scattered opponents. This led to a second point. The increasingly centralized government that the Bolsheviks had crafted in their determination to do whatever it took to survive had certainly been an asset. This increasingly centralized and powerful government would also form the beginnings of a total state with ambitions reaching far beyond those of liberal governments of previous decades. One particular policy which had been instituted in order to really consolidate this control in economics had been important as well. This was the economic policy of war communism, as it was called. It was a radical departure from earlier models of economic organization in which the government subjected the entire economy to relentless centralization and nationalization That is to say, government control of factories, banks, and land. All of this reflected and in many ways emulated Lenin's earlier admiration for what the German generals had achieved in the mobilization of Germany for total war, their policy of war socialism. Lenin had felt that by some accident of history, even the German imperialists had stumbled on a tactic for the future organization of future societies. Another element that had been important in the victory of the Bolsheviks had been the remarkable establishment of a new kind of fighting force, the Red Army. The Red Army had been created by decree on January 28, 1918. The man who was in control of the organizational efforts to create this army was Leon Trotsky, who had been war commissar from March 1918 and was charged with the formidable task of organizing out of the remnants of what remained of the Imperial Army insofar as it could be enrolled into the new Red Army, or from new elements, a workers' and peasants' Red Army. He did so from a mobile command post, his armored train. Trotsky had a special predilection for the armored trains that soon became a visual symbol for the force and the organization and the speed and dynamism of the communist forces. He felt that they were decisive in victory because they could appear wherever the battle raged most fiercely. They could bring with them ideological fervor in the sense of agitating among soldiers to hold out and to defend the revolution. They could bring badly needed supplies. They were above all emblematic of the modernity and the future orientation of the Bolshevik regime. But Trotsky, as a realist, understood that he needed not merely to mobilize will, but also to use the human material at hand. Former imperial officers of the Russian army were drafted, some willingly, like Marshal Tukhachevsky, some unwillingly. They were forced to serve under the supervision of special kinds of supervisors known as political commissars. The Red Army would have a dual system of leadership. One was military and professional, often under old officers of the old regime, and a political authority, the supervision of commissars with their ideological control. To further clamp down and consolidate control in the areas in which the Bolsheviks reigned, they used as well another tool of government, the Cheka secret police. The Chekists, as the secret policemen were known in their trademark long black leather coats and their pistols, fanned out across these areas and used terror as an accepted weapon to consolidate control. They did so following an official decree of September 5th, 1918 on Red Terror, but in practice had been using Red Terror before. When we consider these achievements, as the Bolsheviks certainly felt them to be, the fact that the Bolshevik regime was still standing after the Civil War had ended, we need yet to keep one fundamental fact in mind. While this had been a victory of sorts, it in other cases had been a disappointment. The Russian Revolution was but to be the first act of a global drama. Those hopes had been disappointed, or at least deferred for the immediate future. The Bolsheviks now, assessing their situation, felt that patience would be necessary. It would be necessary to build upon what one had achieved already in the expectation of a deferred global revolution sometime in the future. As the Bolsheviks considered what they had inherited after the Civil War, they saw a grim scene. They saw a country in ruins, with cities that were depopulated, with an economy reduced to barter, in which money had ceased to have much value or worth. They saw crop failures, which led to famine in the years 1921, 1922. And they saw, moreover, straggling across the blasted countryside, innumerable numbers of orphans, little children who had lost their parents in the vast bloodletting of the Civil War, human beings, quite literally, cast adrift in the tides of history. The Bolshevik leaders recognized that the failure of immediate international revolution, as well as the massive devastation of the Civil War, now made it necessary to adapt the ideological blueprint, to organize for the long haul. Some historians argue that the Civil War, as a pivotal experience for the Bolsheviks, did something to their movement. They argue that it brutalized and militarized the Bolsheviks, shaping their later policies. Other historians point out that in some sense, with a rigorous logic, the Bolshevik movement continued to be true to the vanguard idea that Lenin had championed of working towards a future that in ideological terms had been laid down far earlier and which justified dictatorship and despotism when necessary. By late 1922, the Bolsheviks had worked to consolidate their power in most of the territories of the former Russian Empire. And they had done so except for the Polish territories, Finland, and the Baltic states. The areas under the control of the Bolsheviks, now far beyond simply the Russian homeland, became constituent republics in a new sort of state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, in December of 1922. And it would now be the task of the Bolshevik leadership to take up the challenge of reconstruction. Potentially, this could be a mighty power base, a mighty state for the ideological regime. They controlled now, as it were, a sixth of the world's land area and potentially enormous resources as well as populations that could be put to their uses. But something more than a mere reconstruction was aimed at by the Bolsheviks, and it's important to keep this in mind. Their project also was the building of a future society of socialism unlike any that had come before. Lenin expected certainly that international aid might be possible and might be used for the ends of the Bolsheviks. He joked that the capitalists were so greedy that they'd be willing, in fact, to sell the Bolsheviks the very rope with which they eventually would be hanged when the future had arrived. Engineers in particular and technological experts from the Western world, including the United States, were urged, whether out of ideological conviction and sympathy in some cases, or whether out of simply the lure in participating in the building of something new, were urged to come to the Soviet Union and participate in this massive act of building communism. We need to examine the outlines of this emerging Soviet power. The regime's innovative new plans were propagated with a modern use of media. Posters of remarkably modern form, cinema with experimental forms used for the first time, as well as other forms of art now were put to the uses of the Bolshevik ideology. Lenin and his associates were very clear on the importance that cinema and film would have. Lenin considered film in particular to be the political art form of the 20th century, and he'd be very right in this sense. Film could communicate with emotional power, even to populations that were not fully literate, ideological messages of enormous power. And they would seek to harness these media. They showed their love of trains, which we'd already seen in the case of Trotsky's championing of armored trains, but now put to a new use in the so-called agitprop trains. This was one of those bureaucratic acronyms. Agitation and propaganda were smushed together as two separate words into a new art form. Agitprop represented a new form of political propaganda that was to be sent out into the country on trains which had installed within them film theaters sent out into the countryside to spread the innovative new cultural and artistic message. One can well imagine that avant-garde artists enthusiastically participated in these campaigns, creating those films and those posters in a bright initial period of experimentation in which it felt that a new civilization was being created. In line with this emphasis on novelty and modernity and technology, one needs to keep in mind that electrification was a key symbolic goal of the Soviet Union. Lenin announced in what really amounted to a formula for the future that communism equals electrification plus the power of the Soviets. Electrification, the spreading of light and enlightenment, in line with the communist ideology seemed to be the wave of the future. Careful planning and direction would be needed in the construction of such a new society, and especially in economics, this was clear. In February of 1921, a new institution which symbolized this determination to plan was established. It was called, in that particular predilection for acronyms, Gosplan, which stood for the State Planning Commission, which established scientific goals for a supposedly scientifically planned and coordinated economy, planned down to the smallest details. Meanwhile, the secret police, the Cheka, continued to operate, headed, oddly enough, by a former Polish aristocrat turned communist by the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky. Under a succession of later names, as it underwent institutional transformation again and again, the secret police, whether known as at first the Cheka, later the GPU, the UGPU, the NKVD, later in our times the KGB, remained a permanent fixture of Soviet life, using terror to enact the regime's demands. Through the 1920s, long before Stalin's consolidation of his regime and its harsh measures, already an estimated 100,000 prisoners were being held in concentration camps, which Stalin would later expand rather than create where nothing existed before. A dualism of power was also characteristic and standard throughout the structures of the Soviet Union. The state apparatus, the institutions of government, were paralleled by party structures which very often held the true power of direction. It was difficult to see exactly within the structures of the Soviet Union where real power might lie. When Stalin came to power, that question would be answered. There came, however, a traumatic major shock to the Soviet regime, and that was the Kronstadt Revolt in 1921. It was a major shock because it cut right to the claims of the legitimacy of the Bolshevik regime. At Kronstadt Naval Base, across the bay from Petrograd, on March 1921, a revolt of sailors took place. These sailors had been some of the earliest, most determined supporters of the Bolsheviks, but they had started to turn away from them as they disagreed with the route which the Bolsheviks were taking. The sailors had started to resent the harsh discipline and political repression that their Bolshevik allies had begun to institute. They now started to protest and demanded economic reforms. They demanded the reform of the Soviet councils to free them of the increasingly severe Bolshevik control and instead to recreate them as true democratic institutions. They demanded free speech, which they saw as being undercut, and demanded an end to political dictatorship. However, Trotsky, as well as General Tukhachevsky, brutally suppressed the revolt, moving their troops forward across the ice in order to take Kronstadt and to execute the rebel sailors. Kronstadt, besides being an important military event, was far more important as a serious ideological blow to the regime, which claimed to speak from the masses, for the masses, but by 1921 had crushed the challenge from below on the part of some of its own early supporters. This crisis helped move Bolshevik leaders towards a change of course in some policies, especially in economics, which came to be called the New Economic Policy, announced in March 1921, which reintroduced elements of a market economy. Now, the Kronstadt crisis was not the only reason for these reforms. Far more important was the fact that the previous policy of war communist centralization had been important during the Civil War to centralize economic powers in the hands of the state, but had proved a failure after the Civil War in trying to create economic renewal. Thus, the new economic policy changed and loosened that government control. In agriculture, in the areas of small shops and small factories, it was now allowed to produce for the market and for profit after meeting certain tax obligations of the state. What one saw on a limited scale was the reappearance of private initiative and of the market. Special kinds of people who were known as the NEP men, those who followed the initiatives and the new freedoms of the new economic policy, essentially private businessmen, reappeared as economic recovery grew as a result of these incentives. There seemed also new opportunities for outside enterprise. The American Ford Motor Company, for instance, set up a plant in the Soviet Union as a venture. But it was crucial to observe that the Bolshevik government retained control. Lenin saw the new economic policy as a temporary tactical retreat or an economic concession, not a permanent measure. In some sense, he was retracing his steps that we'd seen before in his flexibility at the time of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when he had argued to his associates that it was necessary to take one step back sometimes in order ultimately to take two steps forward. In order to retain control, the state was careful not to relinquish its grasp of what was called the commanding heights of the economy. These were large industry in certain strategic sectors, major factories, the mines, the transportation industry, and the banks. The new economic policy was not a break with state control. At the same time as certain economic measures were being loosened and restraints shed, within the party, control was ratcheted up. A rule against factions was encouraged by Lenin himself, which aimed to make sure that the party moved together as one without dissent within. Ultimately, this rule against factions would be a very dangerous measure in other hands, in the hands of an associate of Lenin's by the name of Stalin. The government also energetically attacked organized religion and the churches. They had held true to Marxist beliefs that religion was an opiate of the people, deluding the masses, acting like crack on the intelligence of otherwise rational individuals. And for that reason, the Russian Orthodox Church, Jewish religious institutions, as well as other religious faiths were energetically attacked. Thousands of clergy executed in these first years. Lenin's period of rule, however, was succeeded by the rise, almost imperceptibly at first, of a curiously gray and indistinct, out-of-focus character, a man by the name of Stalin. Stalin would come to the fore slowly, especially as Lenin's grasp on leadership faded. In May of 1922, a stroke largely incapacitated Lenin, and though for a while he hobbled on, he eventually died on January 21st of 1924. And now the scramble to succeed this remarkable mastermind of revolution, Lenin, began in earnest. Lenin had not had a very good relationship with any potential heirs. He had had few good things to say about many of them. He had criticized Stalin in particular for his rudeness. This was perhaps a too mild a statement given his later record, but Lenin didn't endorse anyone unproblematically, and that meant that the Bolshevik leadership had to contend on its own to settle this problem. The leading contenders for the top position were two men in particular, Leon Trotsky, this formidable figure of Great Red October, as well as the bureaucrat Joseph Stalin. Trotsky's assets were clear. Personal charisma. He was a great and fierce orator. He had a fiery intelligence of great sharpness and acuity, and he had played an active role in the revolution, was a prime mover of the seizure of power in Red October. Trotsky championed radical ideals, the notion of permanent revolution, to speed up the revolutionary process as a key concept for the future of the Soviet Union and the world revolution at large. He was clearly an important and compelling figure. Stalin, by contrast, was very different. He had a lackluster personality, very little talent for rhetoric or oratory, but he did have the asset of a certain genius for bureaucratic and organizational activity behind the scenes. This talent meant that as General Secretary of the party since 1922, he had done much to place supporters of his own in key party positions and to win their loyalty. Stalin, by contrast, who had not participated actively in the Great Red October, could draw upon such reserves, while Trotsky was out giving fiery speeches Stalin worked behind the scenes. He advanced the slogan, a good deal less radical, so it seemed, than Trotsky's, of building socialism in one country, urging consolidation and strengthening of the Soviet state at home as the first priority before other adventures. The outcome was ultimately a clear one. Through astute maneuver, Stalin engineered Trotsky's marginalization, then his expulsion from his own party in 1927. He was exiled first to Central Asia and then expelled from the country itself, and later assassinated in Mexico by one of Stalin's agents. Stalin shifted his position repeatedly within the Soviet Union's politics, allying himself at first with Zinoviev and Kamenev's left wing, then with Bukharin's right wing, turning on each in succession. By 1927, Stalin was in a dominant position in the Soviet government and party apparatus. And in the following years, he would reshape the regime, as well as Soviet society, in his own image. And this larger and tremendously violent policy of the Stalinization of the Soviet Union we'll explore more fully in our next lecture.